We're going to go to Ken Roberts. Ken, to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Gary. I appreciate the opportunity to shed some insight today. First of all, I want to thank the Valley Soil and Water Conservation Districts. I noticed that the 150 people that are currently on the call, Paul Client, Justin Florence, and Art Troutner on there. These gentlemen and others have spent numerous hours volunteering to help in water quality stuff over many, many years. I will say lessons learned are is something that I will just share a quick story. Things that I've learned, experience has a way of teaching us about lessons. And I know from my experience in the Idaho Legislature and whatnot that I wish I knew then what I know now. And I think that's something that we can all relate to when it comes to water quality issues in Lake Cascade and in Fayette Lake. I look forward to working together with all of the stakeholders, improving water quality in the lakes. Agricultural definitely has its impacts on the reservoir. And I think you'll see that over time that agricultural actually is a friend to water quality in the Cascade Reservoir. And I'll try to talk about that briefly. So here's a few lessons learned. I wanted to share a presentation here. So first of all, I think when we talk about historical lessons learned, there's a few things that really enter in, and I'm glad to hear David also talk about some of these things as well. So a couple important things about history of Valley County, the soils. There are highly fertile volcanic soils. They have incredible, what we call CEC capacity, cation exchange capacities, which store a lot of nutrients. They're primarily sandy loam soils. They're high in organic matter. They have a low pH. And prior to the electrification process of mining phosphate, similar to that they do down in Pocatello, the mineral apatite is a naturally occurring source of phosphorus. And there were actually intent on mining for that apatite in Valley County, especially in the Gold Fork area. So that results in a high background level for naturally occurring phosphorus. Another thing about the soils in Valley County are typically highly compacted, which restrict infiltration rates. A couple things about the valley and the mountains. As David previously said, it's a natural basin. There's a reason that Cascade has its name of Cascade. It was because of the cascading Payette as it crossed over the rocks near where the current Cascade Dam is. And so that naturally created a basin in the valley, even before Cascade Reservoir was created. So there are well-established stakeholders in this process. They involve timber, agricultural interests, communities that we've heard from the cities today. I'm glad to hear Judy Nusula say that you had a constituent that said, well, they didn't know exactly where their water came from and they didn't know exactly where their water went when they flushed the toilet. So that's a knowledge base that I think that's important for us all to realize. We also have stakeholders in state and federal government. So here's back with my slides now. I think there's some just a little quick history about what happened in the 90s and early 2000s. The city of McCall was successful in creating the wastewater storage facility, land application with the J-Ditch project. North Lake Sewer and Water District was formed, had made improvements. You can see the improvements on the screen. Best management practices were identified and ranked by the Soil and Water Conservation District, which included but not limited to conversions to sprinkler irrigation, pump back projects, fencing of riparian areas, and creating buffer zones, and stock water development. So what works? And I guess I want to talk about some principles that have a history of success. So incentive-based best management practices are something that actually work quite well in Valley County. It's important, number one, I think that what we learned when I chaired the Cascade Reservoir Coordinating Council back in the 90s, that you have to prioritize best management practices. Voluntary participation is vital. It's much easier to incentivize those types of projects than it is to regulate them. Cost share percentages must motivate participation on private land. And what I mean by that is it has to have an economic viability to it. It must, allow for landowners to participate and do the right thing. So there's, when it comes to those kind of projects, it takes some funding source. So what are some things we talk about for funding? So you have to access multiple sources. They can be individuals, the cities and counties, the state, the federal, and the federal has two partners in this. One is the Bureau of Reclamation, which we're going to hear from later today and in the next several weeks. The BPA, or Bonneville Power Administration, also is a funding source that can be tapped into. I think in regards to all of those, it's important to seek a dedicated funding source that's ongoing, or at least a multiple year commitment. Some other observations, and I think this is important. There's some of the water quality impacts in the area that are just the way it is. It's the background levels of phosphorus that occur naturally in the soils. It's the soil characteristics, and it's also spring runoff. I'm sorry, but when there's 2 or 3 or 4 feet of snow on the valley floor and it warms up in the spring and March, there's not a lot of potential things that we can do. Those are just things the way it is. However, there are things that we can do and that we can make changes. We need to always keep in mind, I think something that we learned in the initial round of this is there's a diminishing returns is in play. You can spend millions and millions of dollars, but we really ought to go after the ones that have the best return first. Agricultural and forestry production are beneficial by removing nutrients. I said I would talk about this briefly. Every truckload of hay or grain that we ship out of our farm takes with it phosphorus. Every load of cattle that's moved out of Valley County takes with it phosphorus, because those plants and those animals retain phosphorus in their bodies. They are helpful in the removal of phosphorus. However, there are projects and BMPs that should be balanced and implemented. And we must be mindful of balancing the economic needs of various industries and businesses with water quality improvement efforts. Make it affordable so people will get behind those programs and participate. Here's a couple ideas that we talked about in the mid-90s. We thought at the time had great potential. Stilling basins or impoundments work very well to catch or still out phosphorus. Some of the large-scale projects that could have huge benefit with a reasonable cost are the Lake Fork Creek, the Gold Fork River, and the Payette River. What do we mean by those? We talked significantly about these in the mid-90s, about creating a stilling basin. I'll just use one of them, for example, on the Lake Fork Creek. Where the Esperage is, west of Donnelly, there's a dike that runs across the reservoir that the road is built on the top of. If the reservoir could create an impoundment at basically full height to the north of that Esperage, you then create a basin for those nutrients to settle out in. DEQ and the Soil and Water Conservation District back in March 20th of 1995, and I'll just read quickly. Wastewater passing through ponds has shown a 67% reduction in phosphorus and a 37% reduction in nitrates. That practice was instituted by my dad on our farm back in the 90s. Some small-scale ponds, private ponds, also have that same potential. Some summer runoff pump back systems are highly effective as well. There's opportunities on Boulder Creek, Mud Creek, and Willow Creek. That water can be captured during the summertime where it's highly concentrated and pumped back into either canal systems or land applied for irrigation. Conversions of irrigation from flood or furrow irrigation to sprinkler irrigation also have great impacts or great improvements to phosphorus. Fencing livestock off the lake is important. However, you need to develop stock water locations so that the stock do have a water source. And I think reasonable setbacks are appropriate as well. Not huge distances, but a reasonable distance. The new 4828, those of you that have been around Lake Cascade for a while understand that that's the elevation when it's in full pool. There was an addition built on the top of the radial gates in Cascade. If you ever go there and look at it, you'll see about a 1-foot extension. It was a splash dam extension. That's caused new creation of erosion around the reservoir. It might be a management thing that would be addressed with the Bureau of Reclamation. And I think it's also brought up, I think Susan Doris brought this up about the drawdowns. We could look at it and explore alternatives to the summertime flow augmentation for the salmon flush. There's also a component there with Idaho Power and backfilling water on the Brownlee Reservoir. So collaboration is the key. Identify and invite all stakeholders, both private, public, and the utilities to the discussions. Competing interests can work successfully together if there's a common goal. And I think it's important to always work towards an attitude of yes, if, and then I think we can get some things done. Appreciate the opportunity to share for a moment today, and look forward to the future discussions and participation from the agricultural industry.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing, Ken. We appreciate the historical perspective.